Theistic Evolution Critique. Theistic Evolution Undermines Christian Doctrines, Part 2. We've been going through the book Theistic Evolution, a scientific, philosophical, and theological critique. And this particular chapter, you will notice, is written by Wayne Grudem, who is one of the editors of the book. There are several positions that one can take on the relationship between the Bible and creation in general. You can have a young life creation and various stripes of that. You can have what's traditionally called an old earth creation, but would be better called an old life creation. You can have intelligent, design-friendly theistic evolution. You can have theistic evolution that is not friendly to intelligent design, that claims that you cannot tell from looking at nature whether God actually did anything. And finally, you can have atheistic evolution, which claims that you can't tell because God didn't do it, and it did it on its own. And this book is not primarily aimed, as many intelligent design arguments are aimed strictly at atheistic evolution. It's primarily aimed at what you could call non-intelligent design-friendly theistic evolution. And they're officially neutral to the first three options and all of their permutations that are listed. This particular chapter I've noted is by Wayne Grudem. It's in section 3, the Biblical and Theological Critique of Theistic Evolution, and it is the introduction, which says Theistic Evolution undermines 12 creation events and several crucial Christian doctrines. And we're going to cover 5 through 12 of those creation events. Just to remind you again of the summary, the chapter provides an overview of the issues raised by theistic evolution in relationship to the truthfulness of the Bible and several historical Christian doctrines. First, it enumerates 12 specific affirmations about the origin of human beings and other living creatures that are held by the most prominent advocates of theistic evolution today. And we're getting nicely into that. It then seeks to show that these affirmations are in direct conflict with multiple passages of Scripture, including passages not only from the Old Testament but also from the 10 books in the New Testament. It concludes that belief in theistic evolution is inconsistent with belief in the truthfulness of the Bible. In addition, it shows how theistic evolution undermines 11 significant Christian doctrines. And it notes that this chapter is heavily indebted to the next two chapters. A summary of the introductory chapter. This chapter must be read in connection with my biblical and theological introduction, for there I explained that this book is not concerned with the age of the earth, or, for that matter, the age of life on earth, or whether Genesis 1 through 3 should be interpreted literally, or whether people who support theistic evolution are genuine Christians or sincere in their beliefs. It's allowing for various positions on all of those questions. Instead, the question from the standpoint of the Bible and theology is whether Genesis 1 through 3 should be understood as a truthful historical narrative reporting events that actually happened. That's the question. Now, he defined theistic evolution, just to review, as God created matter and after that did not guide or intervene or act directly to cause any empirically detectable change in natural behavior of matter until all living things had evolved by purely natural processes. Which means presumably the Exodus could have been a miracle, but the creation and probably the flood were not. An enumeration of 12 theistic evolution beliefs that conflict with creation account in Genesis 1 through 3. To refresh our memories, I concluded my introductory essay with an enumeration of 12 points at which theistic evolution, as currently promoted by its prominent supporters, differs from the biblical creation account if it is taken as a historical narrative. According to theistic evolution, Adam and Eve were not the first human beings, and perhaps they never existed. Adam and Eve were born from human parents if they existed. God did not act directly or specially to create Adam out of dust from the ground, and God did not directly create Eve from a rib taken from Adam's side. And that's where we finished yesterday. Adam and Eve were never sinless beings. Adam and Eve did not commit the first human sins, for human beings were doing morally evil things long before Adam and Eve, and presumably they would be called sins. Human death did not begin as a result of Adam's sin, for human beings existed long before Adam and Eve, and they were always subject to death. So neither sin nor death came from Adam and Eve. Not all human beings have descended from Adam and Eve, for there were thousands of other human beings on earth at the time God chose two of them as Adam and Eve. God did not directly act in the natural world to create different kinds of fish, bird, and land animals. God did not rest from his work of creation or stop any specially creative activity after plants, animals, and human beings appeared on earth. The show goes on in the same way. God never created an originally very good natural world in the sense of a world that was a safe environment free from thorns and thistles and similar harmful things. And finally, after Adam and Eve sinned, God did not place any curse on the world that changed the workings of the natural world and made it more hostile to mankind. Those are propositions that most theistic evolutionists, of the definition that he gave, would agree to. Now I'm going to just skip over a bunch of stuff. Remember, Genesis 1 through 3 is both similar to and different from other historical narratives. And again, we're going to analysis of 12 theistic evolution beliefs, and then we start to number 5 is where we pick up. Adam and Eve were never sinless human beings. Our friends who hold to theistic evolution maintain that Adam and Eve were ordinary human beings doing sinful deeds for their entire lives just as all other human beings do. And by contrast, the entire story of the creation of Adam and Eve as recorded in Genesis 1 to 2 indicates only blessing and favor from God and gives no hint of the existence of any human sin or God's judgment on sin. God created them and God blessed them, and he said to them, and then God saw everything that he'd made, and behold, it was very good. That's, of course, a quote from Genesis 1:31. Very good in the eyes of a holy God implies that there was no sin present in the world. Where there is no sin or guilt, there is also no shame, and so the picture of a sinless world is confirmed by this statement that closes the narrative of Genesis 2. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. But then sin and the guilt and shame that accompany sin began with Adam and Eve eating the forbidden fruit in Genesis 3, and it is only then that the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord among the trees of the garden. This perspective on a sinless creation followed by the fall is also seen in Ecclesiastes. See, this alone I found, that God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes. In the New Testament, the first entrance of sin into the world through the disobedience of Adam is affirmed when Paul says sin came into the world through one man. If sin came into the world through one man, and specifically through that one man's trespass, in verse 15, then Paul is affirming that there was no sin in the world before Adam's sin. This means that God created Adam and Eve as sinless human beings, as the narrative in Genesis 1 through 2 indicates. But theistic evolution argues that Adam and Eve, if they existed at all, were never sinless human beings. Therefore, theistic evolution once again implies that Paul himself was wrong. Adam and Eve did not commit the first human sins, for human beings were doing morally evil things long before Adam and Eve. Again, this is a proposition that theistic evolutionists would mostly agree with. This is the counterpart to the previous point about God not creating Adam and Eve as sinless people. According to theistic evolution, human beings have always committed morally evil deeds, and therefore human beings were sinning for thousands of years before Adam and Eve. But this claim is again in tension with the biblical witness, for just as the Genesis narrative shows that God created Adam and Eve as sinless human beings, see the previous section, it also shows that Adam and Eve committed the first human sins in a world that was perfect and free from human sin. God had commanded Adam not to eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but the serpent tempted Eve, and she ate of the fruit, and then Adam also ate. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. Interesting. Apparently, her husband had either joined her by that point or was already there. After that, sin quickly proliferates as the narrative unfolds. God drives Adam and Eve out of the garden, and then Cain murders Abel, Lamech murders a man in vengeance, and eventually the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thought of his heart was only evil continually. All this is pictured in Genesis as something that began with the initial sin of Adam and Eve. A reference to the sin of Adam and Eve is also the most likely interpretation of a passage in Hosea. That quote mark is a mutation. But like Adam, they transgressed the covenant. Paul reaffirms that sin began with Adam and Eve in extensive discussion in Romans 5. Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and then there's a whole section there that's being quoted. For if many died through one man's trespass, much more of the grace of God and the free gift by the grace of one man, Jesus Christ, abounded for many. And the free gift is not like the result of that one man's trespass. For the judgment following one trespass brought condemnation, but the free gift following many trespasses brought justification. For if because of one man's trespass death reigned through that one man, much more will those who receive the abundance of grace and the free gift of righteousness reign in life through the one man, Jesus Christ. And some of you read that passage many times. Therefore, as one trespass led to condemnation for all, so one act of righteousness leads to justification and life for all men. For as by the one man's disobedience the many were made sinners, so by the one man's obedience the many will be made righteous. Paul also affirms the historicity of the account of the sin of Adam and Eve with reference to a specific detail in Genesis 2. But I'm afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve by his cunning, your thoughts will be led astray from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ. Paul returns to this theme later, in a later epistle, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Therefore, the theistic evolution claimed that thousands of human beings were committing sinful acts long before the time of Adam and Eve would require us again to say that Paul was wrong in what he wrote. Number 7, human death did not begin as a result of Adam's sin, for human beings existed long before Adam and Eve, and they were always subject to death. All living things known to evolutionary science, including human beings, eventually die. And therefore, theistic evolution requires that human beings have always been subject to death and that human beings were dying long before Adam and Eve existed. But according to the biblical narrative, when God first created Adam and Eve, they were not subject to death, as I argued in section 3 above, in response to John Walton's view of formed man of the dust of the ground. That's in last week's discussion. The absence of death when Adam and Eve were created is implied by the summary statement at the end of the 6th day of creation. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. In light of later biblical teachings that death is the last enemy to be destroyed, 1 Corinthians 15:26, and the prediction that in the age to come death shall be no more, in Revelation 21:4, the initial very good creation should be understood to imply that Adam and Eve were not subject to death when they were first created. In addition, in the next chapter, God said to Adam, "But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall surely die." That's Genesis 2:17. This implies that death would be the penalty for disobedience, not something to which they were initially subject. Nothing is implied in Genesis 2 about animal death, for God's statement directed to Adam implies only human death. You shall surely die. After Adam sinned, God pronounced the promised judgment, which would be carried out over time through a life filled with painful toil, culminating in death. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Notice this is arranged in poetic form. In the New Testament, Paul states explicitly that human death came into the world through Adam's sin, for he says, "Therefore just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all have sinned." Once again, the emphasis is on human death, for Paul's statement, "So death spread to all men," uses a plural form of the Greek word anthropos, probably anthropos, a term that refers only to human beings, not to animals. The entire Bible says nothing one way or another about the death of animals before the fall. In 1 Corinthians, Paul affirms again that death came through Adam's sin. For as by a man came death, by a man has come also the resurrection of the life. For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ shall all be made alive. Which is an interesting passage. It's sung in the Messiah by Handel. But theistic evolution requires us to deny that human death began as a result of Adam's sin. And this once again requires us to say that the Genesis account is not a trustworthy historical narrative, and that Paul was wrong. Number 8, not all human beings have descended from Adam and Eve, for there were thousands of other human beings on earth at the time, that God chose 2 of them as Adam and Eve. The Adam and Eve, that's assuming that he even did that, according to some theistic evolutionists. The Adam and Eve advocated by theistic evolution were just 2 individuals among many thousands on earth at the time, and therefore not all human beings have descended from Adam and Eve. Although you might be able to squish that a little bit because there is a mitochondrial Eve and there's a Y chromosome Adam. But Genesis portrays Adam and Eve as the first human beings, see section 1 above, and that is why God says to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it." The earth had no human beings, so Adam and Eve were to begin to fill it. Later in Genesis, the man called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all living. That's Genesis 3:20, which implies that she was, in fact, the mother of all living, or at least of all living people. The sentence cannot mean all living things because plants and animals existed before Adam and Eve. And so the intended sense must be all living human beings. All human beings have descended from Adam as the male progenitor and from Eve, his wife, as the female progenitor. By contrast, several theistic evolution authors claim that there must have been many other human beings on the earth at the time of Adam and Eve. The evidence they give is that Cain's wife, Genesis 4:17, had to come from somewhere, and Cain expected that there were other people who would want to kill him. Genesis 4:14. Genesis even says that Cain built a city which had to be a place populated by numerous people. Again, Genesis 4:17. But are we to think that the author of Genesis, whom I believe to be Moses, was unaware of this difficulty? The text of Genesis itself provides an obvious solution to this problem because it says that Adam lived 930 years and he had other sons and daughters. Genesis 5:4-5. How many? Text does not say. But Adam and Eve, created as full-grown adults, could have begun to have children in their very first year. Adam was 130 years old when Seth was born, but he and Eve could well have had many dozens of children both prior to that time and after that time. The text does not tell us. Yes, this requires that Cain and Seth and others would have married their sisters in the first generation. But that was necessary in order to have the entire human race descended from Adam and Eve, and the prohibitions against incest were not given by God until much later. In the New Testament, Paul said that God made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth. This implies that all human beings descended from Adam. Such a descent of the entire human race from Adam is important because, A, it shows the actual physical unity of the human race, thus precluding any ideas of racial superiority or inferiority. It is also important, B, because it explains how the guilt of Adam's sin could be justly imputed to all his descendants, and it provides the mechanism by which a sinful nature or disposition towards sin has been transmitted from generation to generation throughout the entire human race. Finally, it is important to C because it provides a category of people who are in Adam in such a way that Adam's sentence of death also applied to all who descended from Adam. For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ shall all be made alive. But theistic evolution denies that all human beings have descended from Adam, and so the actual physical unity of the entire human race is denied, and Adam's role as representative head of the entire human race is nullified because it is inextricably tied to the physical descent of every human being from Adam. God did not directly act in the natural world to create different kinds of fish, birds, and land animals. This is Proposition 9 of Theistic Evolution Common Propositions. Theistic evolution claims that God created matter, and after that he did not guide or intervene to cause any empirically detectable change in the natural behavior of matter until all living things had evolved by purely natural processes. But this proposal is in tension with the picture presented in Genesis, where God carries out distinct and separate actions to directly create different specific parts of creation, and then, in further distinct actions, create specific kinds or types of animals. For example, and God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation," and it was so. That was on day 3, then a separate act on day 5, and God said, "Let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens." By the way, notice the birds come before dinosaurs. Then on day 6 there is more creative activity, and God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind, and God saw that it was good. The Hebrew text includes the direct object marker, eth, 3 times in this verse, showing that there are 3 distinctive direct objects of the verb made, Hebrew, asa. This verse pictures a different active involvement of God in making different kinds of animals, which is far different from the hands-off allowing of matter to evolve following its own properties that we find in theistic evolution. Later, in a separate action, on this same day, God said, "Let us make," once again, another distinctive action designated by the Hebrew asa, man in our image. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. Finally, at the end of the 6th day, God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. The scope of everything that he had made, once again, asa, must include both the separate kinds of animals from day 6 and also man himself from day 6, which had just been specified as things that God made. The picture given in Genesis, therefore, is that God directly made various kinds of animals and also made human beings in distinct separate acts. But theistic evolution says that God did not make these things in any sense that the Hebrew reader of these verses would understand from the verb made, Hebrew asa, but only in the sense that inanimate matter that God had created billions of years earlier at the beginning of the universe evolved by virtue of its own properties with no additional creative active action from God into all these animals and human beings. The Psalms also speak about God's specific act of creating individual parts of nature. David says to God that the moon and the stars are things you have set in place. Then he says to God that many different kinds of animals fall into the category of the works of your hands. What is man that you are mindful of him? You have given him dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, and also all beasts of the field, the birds of the heaven, and the fish of the sea, whatever passes along the paths of the sea. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. These creatures are nowhere said to be the product of materials that assembled themselves, the theistic evolution view. They are specifically the works of God's hands. A similar understanding is found in Psalm 104, which views various creatures as specific indications of God's witness. O Lord, how manifold are your works, in wisdom have you made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. Here is the sea, great and wide, which teems with creatures innumerable, living things both small and great. In the New Testament, Paul speaks of the God who made the world and everything in it. And this is in a philosophical discussion, by the way. In this statement, everything in it must refer to something different from the world itself, and therefore it is best understood to include all the varieties of plants and animals that exist on the earth. See also John 1:3, all things were made through him. A view far different from the idea that matter itself brought all things into existence. In a similar way, Paul said that God's invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. Paul writes, by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. When Paul says everything created by God is good, he is speaking specifically about foods that God created to be received with thanksgiving. Foods which are made from living plants and animals. The book of Revelation includes two additional references affirming that God himself, not inanimate matter, created all things that existed in the world, including specifically all creatures of the sea. Worthy are you, O our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they existed and were created. Well, actually what he did was create matter, and it kind of did its own thing to create the rest of it. Somehow that takes the sting out of that, or the oomph out of that passage in Revelation. Him who lives forever and ever, who created heaven and what is in it, the earth and what is in it, and the sea and what is in it. None of the original readers of Genesis or of these New Testament writings would have understood these verses to mean that God originally created non-living matter, and that this matter then created all living things over the course of billions of years without any additional intervention from God. But theistic evolution requires us to believe that these passages from Genesis, Psalms, Acts, Romans, Colossians, 1 Timothy, and Revelation are all mistaken in the way they tell us of God's direct and specific creation of all things in heaven and on earth. Number 10 of those theistic evolution beliefs: God did not rest from his work of creation or stop any special creative activity after plants, animals, and human beings appeared on earth. Theistic evolution holds that after the initial creation of matter, God did not intervene in the world to create any living things. Carl Giberson and Francis Collins say the model for divinely guided evolution that we are proposing here thus requires no intrusions from the outside for its account of God's creative process, except for the origin of natural laws guiding the process. But this also means that according to theistic evolution, there was no special activity of God from which he could have rested after the 6 days of creation recorded in Genesis 1. The biblical record, however, is incompatible with this theistic evolution viewpoint, for after narrating the events of God's 6 creative days of creative work, it says, "Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the 7th day God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work which he had done. So God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation." Oxford mathematics professor John Lennox explains why these verses cannot be reconciled with theistic evolution. According to Genesis, then, creation involved not just one, but a sequence of several discrete creation acts, after which God rested. This surely implies that those acts involve processes that are not going on at the moment. In both Old and New Testaments, the Bible clearly distinguishes between God's initial acts of creation on the one hand and his subsequent upholding of the universe on the other. This distinction is also apparent in Genesis 1. It records a sequence of creation acts followed by God's resting. I also think, by contrast with my theistic evolutionary friends, that science supports this distinction. 2 additional passages in Scripture also view this Genesis account of God's resting as an actual historical event, something that really happened. First, in the 10 Commandments, God himself says, "For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." Words that are quite familiar to most of us here. Then the author of Hebrews also affirmed that God rested from his work of creation. "For he has somewhere spoken of the 7th day in this way, and God rested on the 7th day from all his works. For whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works, as God did from his." Yet, according to a theistic evolution viewpoint, there was no special kind of work that God did during those 6 days of creation, because the providential work of God in sustaining the materials of the universe while evolution was happening was no different from the ongoing providential work of God in sustaining the materials of the universe even today. There was no particular creative work of God from which he could rest. God never created an originally very good natural world in the sense of a safe environment that was free of thorns and thistles and similar harmful things. This is Proposition 11 of Theistic Evolutionists. Theistic evolution requires that all plants and animals living today resulted from an unbroken line of evolutionary change, and therefore there never was a different kind of natural order from what we know today. By contrast, for many centuries, interpreters have understood Genesis 1 to 2 to speak of an idyllic Garden of Eden, an earth in which there were no thorns and thistles, no curse on the ground because of sin, and by implication no weeds hindering beneficial crops, no natural disasters such as hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, floods, or droughts. It was also thought to be an earth where no animals were hostile to human beings because of the prophetic predictions of God's future restoration of an earth where the nursing child shall play over the hole of the cobra, and the weaned child shall put his hand on the adder's den, and they shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain. This was understood, I think rightly, to be the kind of earth implied by the summary statement at the end of the sixth day of creation. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Indeed, the kind of earth that we have today, with frequent earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, droughts, poisonous snakes, venomous scorpions, malaria-spreading mosquitoes, and man-eating sharks and lions, can hardly be thought of to be the best kind of creation God could make, a creation that would cause God to say, and behold, it was very good. Skipping over a paragraph, but theistic evolution cannot affirm such an originally idyllic creation because it holds that all living things as they exist today, including all the things that are hostile to human beings, are the results of a fully natural evolutionary process. Therefore, the earth has always been the way it is today. Therefore, the picture of an idyllic creation given in Genesis is not a historically reliable narrative. And finally, number 12, after Adam and Eve sinned, God did not place any curse on the world that changed the working of the natural world and made it more hostile to mankind. This belief of theistic evolution advocates is the counterpart of the previous point. They do not believe in original idyllic creation, and so they also do not believe that God placed a curse on the ground as a judgment for Adam's sin, or that God altered the operation of nature in any way to make the world more hostile to human beings. But the biblical text, if understood as a historical record of actual events, shows that God did indeed alter the workings of the natural world when he spoke to Adam in words of judgment. And to Adam he said, because you've listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded of you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain shall you eat of it all the days of your life. Notice this is a Hebrew poetry. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. For you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Adam's life would eventually end in death. To dust you shall return. But even while he continued alive, his life would consist of painful toil to provide enough food from the ground that had now become hostile. Cursed is the ground. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread. God's statement that the ground would now produce thorns and thistles is best understood as a synecdoche, a common feature in biblical speech by which two or three concrete examples represent an entire category of things. Taken in this way, God's word of judgment means that the earth would not only produce thorns and thistles, but it would also harbor insects that would destroy crops, such as locusts, and there's some text, diseases that would consume them, foraging animals that would eat crops before they could be harvested, and floods and droughts, tornadoes and hurricanes that would make farming difficult and life precarious. Paul affirms in the New Testament that the present operation of the natural world is not the way God originally created it to work, but is the result of God's judgment. He pictures nature as longing to be freed from its bondage in much the same way as we long to be freed from our dying physical bodies and obtain new resurrection bodies. Ooh, that could be Adventist. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved. Paul does not say that the creation will suddenly be raised to a brand new, wonderful state of operation that it has never known before. Instead, he says that the creation will be set free from its bondage, and the bondage to which it was previously subjected. Surely he is here referring to God's curse on the ground and his alterations of the functioning of nature because of sin in Genesis 3. But theistic evolution requires us to affirm that Paul was also wrong at this point. Part E, specific Christian doctrines that are undermined or denied by theistic evolution. Why is this entire issue of theistic evolution important? Ideas often have consequences in our lives. And theistic evolution, as an overarching explanation for the origin of all living things, leads to several destructive consequences for a number of Christian doctrines. Theistic evolution is not at all a harmless alternative opinion about creation, but will lead to progressive erosion and often even a denial of at least the following 11 Christian doctrines. Number 1, the truthfulness of the Bible. As I've argued in the pages above, proponents of theistic evolution must deny that Genesis 1 through 3 should be understood as historical narrative in the sense of literature that intends to report events that actually happened. But in contrast to theistic evolution, these chapters are understood as truthful historical narrative by later chapters in Genesis, as well as by later Old Testament passages in Exodus, 1 Chronicles, Psalms, and Hosea. In addition, theistic evolution requires us to believe that both Jesus and the New Testament authors were wrong in their affirmations of the historical reliability of many details in Genesis 1 through 3. We've been over a lot of that, and I'm not going to add too much to that, except that a couple of other passages here. The question is not whether the Bible teaches science, whatever that might mean. The question is whether the Bible is truthful in all that it affirms on whatever topic it wishes to speak about. In fact, one way of putting it, which he doesn't say explicitly, is that the Bible is intending to teach history, and maybe at this point history does not conform to evolutionary science. In some theistic evolution literature, the authors double down on their denial of the historical truthfulness of the creation accounts and argue that the Bible affirms other scientifically false ideas as well, thus adding more examples to shore up their denial of the truthfulness of Scripture. You see, it's not just untrue here, but it's also untrue elsewhere. Dennis Lamoureux tells us that the Bible affirms a three-tiered universe with a solid sky overhead that holds back large reservoirs of water. Some of you may have run into that. I think we discussed some of this before. And that Jesus affirmed a scientific falsehood when he said that the mustard seed was the smallest of all seeds on earth. I see some head shaking no in this situation. John Walton claims that the belief in theistic evolution does not entail a denial of biblical inerrancy because no theological point is lost. What? I want you to think about that a little bit. What it means is that inerrancy is not a talisman that will keep this kind of theorizing away. Skipping over several paragraphs and going to section 2, which is divine creation by God's powerful words, which obviously are not believed by theistic evolutionists. Overwhelming evidence in nature for God's existence, which is they specifically deny. That's why they got categorized where they are. Evidence in nature for moral accountability to God. I mean, we may have moral accountability, but you can't tell it from nature. The wisdom of God. The goodness of God. The moral justice of God. Human equality, the atonement, the resurrection, and that's an interesting discussion. I think we'll return to that in a future chapter. The value of improving on nature, the value of ecology, if you like. And the conclusion, theistic evolution as defined by its most respected defenders today implies a denial of 12 specific events that are recorded in Genesis 1 through 3. The placement of these chapters at the beginning of Genesis, the absence of literary markers in these passages signaling to readers that they should be understood in a figurative way, and the matter-of-fact way in which the subsequent chapters in Genesis assume that Genesis 1 through 3 is reliable historical narrative, provide convincing evidence that Genesis 1 through 3 is intended to be taken as a historical record of events that actually happened. In addition, all of these 12 events are affirmed or implied in various places in 4 other books in the Old Testament and 10 books in the New Testament. Because theistic evolution denies the historicity of these 12 events, it also denies or undermines 11 significant Christian doctrines. In sum, belief in theistic evolution is incompatible with the truthfulness of the Bible and with several crucial doctrines of the Christian faith. That's the end of the chapter. Now, my own take on this is that Grudem argues correctly, in my view, that theistic evolution, as he defines it, does not allow the Bible to speak for itself. It has to deny it because the Bible says one thing and modern science says something else. It is interesting that he uses the term truthfulness of the Bible to describe the positive that he wishes to preserve, that he rightly sees that theistic evolution destroys. Inerrancy, theoretically, should be adequate. But obviously, if you read John Walton, it's not. There may be bad news for Grudem. I think truthfulness of the Bible can be twisted as easily as inerrancy by those who wish to consider themselves Christian but feel the pressure from what they believe is science. In my opinion, Walton is right that a better defensive line is that the Bible is correct in what it intends to teach. But Walton is wrong in his understanding of what the Bible intends to teach. The fundamental problem is not really in his exegesis even. It is in his unwillingness to recognize that the Bible lives in a world where miracles are possible. And not only possible, but happen. And if science is defined as excluding miracle, and especially if science encompasses everything, then science is fundamentally opposed to the biblical worldview. Science was not always this way. Science does not need to be this way. But if you're going to define science in this way, science then becomes irreconcilable with the biblical worldview, and it is pointless to try a harmonization. That is why I am so comfortable with C.S. Lewis, even though, as we've discussed a few Sabbaths ago, I disagree with him on several subjects. He realizes the key point that Christianity requires miracles, and on that point, the spirit of the age is wrong. The reason that this point is so important is that as long as the pressure to avoid miracles exists, no defensive line around the Bible can protect it. Not inerrancy, not truthfulness, not intelligibility, nothing. As long as we must reinterpret the history behind the Bible to exclude miracle, the Bible will be either studiously ignored or outright denied. I think the latter is probably more honest. Once we allow the possibility of miracle, the Bible can speak clearly for itself. That is why those early chapters are so important. If science cannot explain everything, and if there is evidence for a God who created the universe, inserted life into it, and injected information that was a major cause of the variety of life we see, such as at the Cambrian explosion, then the Bible can gain a hearing, and in my opinion, it will do pretty well. It may take a while, though. The misinformation is not confined to evolution. Some of it is found, for example, in geology, and some of it is found in history. But that's my opinion. Now it's your turn.
Go ahead. Last week, I may have given the wrong impression, so I need to correct it. So during this week, I've done thorough research using the local library where I used to work, and I wanted to find out if Wayne Grudem is a young Earth creation or old Earth creation, because he seems to be a fence strider in his opening statements. He says, I'm not going to deal with the age of the earth question. So really, what is his position? Well, you'll notice he doesn't deal specifically with the 6 days of creation other than to refer to them as a package. And he doesn't deal in, at least what we read today or looked at in the screen, he doesn't deal with whether the days of creation are 24-hour days or eons of time. And I was concluding from his list of 12 affirmations of Scripture that exclude theistic evolution that there should be a 13th affirmation, and that the creation happened in 6 literal 24-hour days. But he never makes that statement. So I went to the library, and I have here...
By the way, Lennox, you might get the same impression, but if you read him very carefully, he does not believe that there are like 6 literal 24-hour consecutive days.
That was kind of shocking to me, because that was the topic of my dissertation done in the 1990s.
This is Systematic Theology by Grudem there?
Yeah, Systematic Theology by Wayne Grudem. It's in the library. I'll return it, and if some of you want to go over and look at it in the library here. Massive tome, over 1,000 pages. The particular edition we have says that this had a sale of 500,000 copies. That shocked me, because I don't know of any systematic theology that would have even 100,000 sales. Generally, they're not bestsellers. So this shows that probably his systematic theology has been used in every evangelical seminary, not only in the U.S. but around the world. And it's to be taken seriously. Now, question, why doesn't he say the days are either literal or symbolic? He uses the tactic of Carl F.H. Henry, the first evangelical that really stuck out his neck, defining the word yom for day. And Henry said there are 5 different meanings of the word yom in the Old Testament. Grudem says the same thing. And Grudem says also there are 3 different meanings for the word yom in Genesis 1 through 2, verse 3. You have it being 12 hours, the light portion of the day. You have it being 24 hours in the rest of the days.
And as a matter of fact, it's used right there in Genesis 1. And God called the light day, and he called the darkness night. Yeah,
it's obvious. It's either 12 hours or 24 hours starting out. Then all of a sudden, in chapter 2, verse 3, it says, in the day that the Lord created the heavens and the earth. In the day, implying in the age or at the time, in a generic sense.
Yes, so, and in fact, that particular phrase can be used as when.
That's right. A lot of translations have the word when there, if you look at them. So what I've discovered, this book came along before I really got it. I was almost finished with my research for my dissertation, so I never cited it. This is the first time I had a chance to look at it. But I see Carl F.H. Henry all the way through. And Henry really carried the day on Genesis 1 and 2, allowing for long ages. He really shifted the whole evangelical world more than perhaps anyone else except Bernard Ram had started the process. And I did my dissertation both on Ram and Henry. And so now we can add Grudem to it. And that's why he's opening the door to long ages. Now, what do you do with the 4th day of creation that God created or made, the greater and the lesser light? He takes a NIV and some other modern translations, and he translated it, and God had made on the 4th day the greater and the lesser light. In other words, it opens the door to any time in the past he had made them. And the 4th day was to honor the fact that he had made them. That's some really creative exegesis.
To be fair, there are people that do that to the animals that were brought to Adam.
That's right.
And the Lord had made all the animals, and he brought them to Adam.
That's right. Yeah.
So
that's NIV.
It's not just
2.
crazy, because the fact of the matter is Hebrew only has 2 tenses,
right?
Perfect and imperfect, usually thought of as past and future, but that's not strictly accurate. And if you think of the ways that we use words in English, you can see that sometimes the distinction between perfect and pluperfect can get lost.
Mm-hmm. So the question I have today, and for everyone to think about, is why would someone like Grudem follow the historicity of Genesis 1, 2, and 3 almost to a T, all the way, all 12 points? Then all of a sudden, when he comes to a possible 13th point on the nature of the creation days, all of a sudden he becomes deathly silent. Why the inconsistency? And that's the question I raised in my dissertation. I'm not sure I have even good answers why, you can go in 2 different directions at once.
Well, if I were to say, I think if I was to make my guess, it would be he's comfortable with saying that God created the animals.
Right.
And in fact, that he would be very happy to hear Stephen Meyer looking at the Cambrian explosion and saying somebody had to put information in it.
Right.
And why not God, especially since the kind of information that would be required would require, at this point, a superhuman intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
So I think he's comfortable with saying God intervened, and we're just going to have to deal with it. But I don't think he wants to take the age question on. And that's really the crux of the matter.
Well, it is a hot topic.
Yeah. Yes, comment over here.
I have to preface this by saying that I may not have heard everything that has been said, but to the degree that I think I have, I'd like to insert a simple observation, not knowing anything about ancient Hebrew or the language or the linguistics that Warren certainly obviously does, or that you do. But I have been impressed in reading the English version, specifically the Shakespearean version, the King James version, particularly of the Old Testament, that God himself, in inspiring that text, specifically Isaiah, frequently switches from the second to the first to the third person and the present to the past. And in such texts as Isaiah 58, he said, I will cause thee to ride upon the high places of the earth. But in previous verses, he doesn't speak as though he's even the first person. He's rather buried in it. If the folks that are more familiar with the language can clarify me on that. But I would propose that the way that God inspires, the way that he spoke in Isaiah, is the way that he inspired Moses to speak of Genesis. And I would appreciate a comment to clarify me on that.
Well said. Can't disagree.
Also, in answer to your question as to why he suddenly switched, I would propose that he, knowingly or unknowingly, was devising a way to avoid the fourth commandment, that he rested on the seventh day and hallowed it. he seems to go out of his way in his obviously very, very detailed undertaking to refute theistic evolution. He went out of his way to avoid having to say that God rested on the sixth day. And I'm sure there must be comments on that.
Yeah, I want to jump in right now. I know there are others that want to speak to this. He doesn't really avoid the fourth commandment. He avoids parts of the fourth commandment. You notice today he had the fourth commandment. It was on the screen. And he was emphasizing the resting part, that God rested. But there's the last part of the phrase in the fourth commandment, that God, within 6 days, God made heaven and earth and the sea and all that in them is. He avoids that part, because if you take that literally, all that in them is could be all of the living things.
And he also avoids and sanctified them, made them holy.
Yeah.
That he avoided.
So if you take it literally like the young earth creationists, you have to put everything created within 144 hours based on the fourth commandment. And they take the fourth commandment that literally.
But we're going to let Jack say it, and then we'll give it to you.
Well, this is a bit of a diversion, but I'm personally still where I was last week, and that is this whole presentation rests on stating that God had no creative activity other than setting up the physical characteristics of the universe.
That is correct.
And
that is the viewpoint that he is arguing against.
And his whole argument falls apart in terms of saying theistic evolution must do this and this and this. If the forms of theistic evolution that are held by many allow for God's significant creativity of life.
You know, here's an interesting point. And that is the distinction between God did it but you can't tell, or he set it up so that it would be done, and that's why you can't tell, and the position that God did some kind of intervening that is at least statistically detectable, maybe even physically detectable. It sounds like a moot point. But it, in fact, is the precise dividing line between ID-friendly theistic evolution and ID-unfriendly theistic evolution.
And he's really forced theistic evolution into ID-unfriendly.
I don't think he's forced it into. I think he's detecting an actual point that they're making. And this is, I think, an important point. One of the things that I watched personally right here in Loma Linda is somebody invited Philip Johnson down to visit us and to give us some talks and engage in discussions. And I thought, this could go very badly for conservative Adventists, because the more liberal Adventists could say, we agree with Philip Johnson that God intervened. It just took a long time. It is a possibility. What stunned me when he came here was that the opponents of Philip Johnson, the opponents of Adventism turned out to be opponents of Philip Johnson as well. That is to say, they kind of got themselves a spokesman. The spokesman was none other than Irv Taylor. God rest his soul. and he proceeded to argue vigorously against the point of view of Philip Johnson. If it was really true that we had a large number of people who were willing to say, well, God did it, He intervened, but it just took a long time, they would have been able to find somebody who would have been happy to assure us that we're all on the same page. And Philip Johnson would have had to have said, probably would have been comfortable saying, yeah, I agree, let's not fight. The real critical point is, can you detect God's presence, God's activity? That's the real critical point. And he would have made common cause with them. As it was, he wound up, because I was the person on the other side of Taylor for this, so I remember it quite well. And I just simply let the two of them argue. Because what it did was it showed up that the people who were theistic evolutionists were in fact ID-unfriendly theistic evolutionists. Maybe in the case of Irv, not even a theistic evolutionist. There was a point where he was unable to say whether he could tell his granddaughter that there was a God. Now that's not to say he was atheistic, pure and simple. He may have been agnostic and leaning one way or the other, and you can't say, but it does say that he's certainly not confidently theist.
Well, my final comment on this is that, to me, and this is personal, I don't expect many to agree with it, this particular author stays as close to philosophical naturalism as he can while bringing God into the picture to minimize the arguments with the others.
That may very well be true.
Which to me is a huge problem.
Anyway, we have a comment here and then one back here.
So my question is, can we have a young creation and an old earth, or are we forced through the creation story to have, and where do we draw the line then? A young earth, and then is it a young solar system and a young galaxy? Where do we draw the line in the creation story?
The
sun and the moon were created. And,
let me make
the stars.
Let me make this semi-personal. And the reason I'm doing that is because, not because I want to elevate myself, but precisely because I want to say that there's a lot of I don't know, and that this is how I see it, but I could be wrong. There was a time when I would follow a more or less standard Adventist version, at least now. Maybe I should say a standard Adventist scientific version, because when it first came out, it was rather controversial in and of itself. Robert Brown probably pioneered it, and as I understand, got quite a bit of flack from doing so. That the material of the earth was around for thousands, millions, whatever of years. 4.3 billion, why not? Okay. But then, at a point, he would put it about 7,500 years ago. But knowing him, I don't think he would not object strenuously to somebody believing that it was more like 6 or more like 10. That that God basically resurfaced the entire earth, created all the life forms in a way which substantially follows the Genesis account. That is why I'm cautious about saying, and I think that that's substantially a young life creationist, even though it's an old earth creationist in that sense. And old earth would mean old sun, old moon, old stars, old planets, everything. Okay. One of the major arguments for that was the absence of intermediate half-life radioactive elements. There's now some evidence for accelerated decay in the past. It's not conclusive, and I think that it should be worked on more. It's certainly promising, but if one has accelerated decay and it has something to do with the half-lives, then I think that it is perfectly reasonable to start to say that the evidence for an old Earth is at least questionable. And in fact, there is some evidence now that is kind of branched out from the field I'm working on, which is radiocarbon dating, that suggests that perhaps either some weird stuff has happened, or diamonds themselves, which means stuff that's supposed to be 1-2 billion years old, are not as old as they claim either. In which case, the argument for a long age for life on Earth sort of starts to get iffy, and there's, you could say there's actually positive evidence for a short age for life on Earth. And so that's where I see most of the evidence coming. But having said that, I am no more willing to say that the people who see it differently from me on that particular question are either scientifically idiots or theologically wicked, any more than I did before I made my personal change. And so I think that there are some things that we don't know that you can make arguments on either side for. And probably the best thing for us to do is to realize that we all see through glass darkly. And I think my vision is better than theirs, but who knows? Okay? So, you know, we need to be really careful about making too much about that. And of course, in both of those cases, we're not assuming that either the universe or even our galaxy is that young. Maybe it is. There are some people who argue that we've got more supernovae than we should. But then there's the problem of, you know, light coming from distant galaxies. How does that get there that fast if it's only, you know, 6,000 or 8,000 or whatever the number is years old? Maybe it's really only 50 million years old, but in that case, again, you have a vision of things that look like they probably sent light before that period of time. So I'm not saying that the problem can't be solved. There are some interesting propositions for that, but so far as I know, none of them have been able to say, and if you look here, you'll find this that we wouldn't expect from the standard theory. And until they do that, they're not really scientific theories. They're almost, if you like, theological theories. And I'm not willing to go out on a limb for a theological theory which has no possible scientific implications. comments here, and then we'll come back to Jack. Don't keep going. It'll come back.
Hello. I just wanted to kind of express my frustration. It seems like this whole thing is a mess. What I dream to do is actually go to those people and sit down with them and have them explain, why do you think things are this way? Because I really want to know. Because I know they're not stupid. I've had a lot of people suggest that these guys just don't want to be judged at the end of time. You know, and that's why they're avoiding God. That's why they're avoiding everything. But I don't. The older I get, no, that's a bunch of baloney. They are.
Well, some of them may be, but not the ones we're talking about.
Well, yeah. I don't know. I haven't seen any yet. It seems like everybody I've talked to are very sincere in what they believe. And I'd like to know why they believe it. I know that when I get into discussions with people, I start asking questions, and they think just with my questions, I'm arguing with them. But questions come up, and I ask them. And but anyway, you went through a lot of points here, and I was just thinking, you know, why do people think that? You know, there must be a reason for it, and you just can't get into it. And that's what really kind of frustrates me, and that's kind of what I wanted to say.
Well, perhaps one of these days we should dig out one of their articles and go through it.
No, I don't think I want to do an article. I'd like to talk to them personally.
Oh, let them just
if
they
answer.
Come through here and they're willing to talk to us, I'll have them. You better believe it.
It's a dream. I'll admit that.
Yeah, I kind of share the same frustration in that, you know, the basic issue is, you know, he pointed out these 12 different reasons about theistic evolution that he was contesting, but really all they're trying to do is respond to the fact that they find the standard creation interpretation of Genesis inadequate to deal with the science that they have come to understand. And that's basically where the problem is. So they create these stories called Theistic Evolution that tries to justify their position. And so we end up spending a lot of time talking about these very issues when it's not necessary, because we're getting sidetracked on all these side proposals of theirs that really can't be justified, and so the real discussion, you know, I think should be towards alternative perspectives such as Sailhammer's Genesis Unbound view, where the interpretation is one of God creating the Garden of Eden rather than the entire earth as a possible perspective to deal with. That's more that has some credibility towards allowing old life, but still interpreting reasonably the God's actions in creating a young earth, but young life. But you know, I appreciate your comments on miracles, and that obviously we can't go without God having some causal input, and that's what a miracle is. It's simply God introducing a causal input from outside the physical realm that we're dealing with. So so I guess I share some of the same frustration as my brother does, and it would be good to I think be able to address those issues. I see so much discussion on theistic evolution where it just is such a sidetracks us on trying to get at exegesis or a worldview that really can't be justified very well in though some people grab onto it because they appreciate the science and what science is saying about old life and an old earth and an old universe. But your comment about radioactive decay accelerating, I think that's going to be difficult to justify, because we can measure the fine structure constant in the most distant galaxies, which is very accurately, and which is determined by quantities associated with protons and electrons in those things, which would have to change if there was a change in radioactive decay. And the fact that we can look at distant galaxies at the edge of the universe and see a fine structure constant that looks the same as we measure here on Earth does not support accelerated radioactive decay, I think, fairly strongly.
Well said.
Well, my answer about radioactive decay obviously would take a lot longer time. And when I was commenting on it, what I was trying to illustrate it is why I see what I see, rather than trying to say, and you all must believe what I believe. Because I think that's exactly what I don't want to have happen, is that the teacher in the Sabbath school class said this, and so it must be so. I mean, we are all looking through a glass darkly, and some things we'll see better than others, and some things we can leave for discussion. I think one of the things that Wayne Grudem is concerned about, if I read correctly, is that he sees there not being a good, coherent story of the plan of salvation if you assume that science has reigned supreme all the way down to, I don't know, where would you draw the line? The Exodus? Would you draw the line at the call of Abraham? Would you draw, somewhere in there, miracle steps in. Unless you had miracle all the way through as something that happens when God decides that this needs to be taken care of, and so he actually acts in history in ways that can be detected, which is what miracle is. Things do not proceed the way we would have expected them usually. And if you continue to not want to draw that line, eventually you get to, well, Jesus was born, and we don't know of people who have parthenogenesis. And if you do have parthenogenesis, it's going to turn out to be a female, because the woman can only take out of her own genetic material. She doesn't have a Y chromosome to give. And so at that point, the virgin birth of Jesus is out the window. And if you keep going that route, you have to say, how many resurrections have you seen lately? That's against science, and so you need to give that up too. And once you give that up, there's very little left of Christianity besides, I guess, the Golden Rule. And you could almost even say, and who says? So I see Grudem watching this thing collapsing if you don't allow for an Adam and Eve. And that's why he carves out Adam and Eve from the entire story. And then it's easier to say, and so he created the trilobites and the hallucinogenia and the early the early vertebrates all at the same time. And then, as time went on, he refined them to, well, actually the chordates. And then as time went on, he refined them to the vertebrates, and then he did more. And when the mammals come, he just had another creative episode. I mean, I think that's how you would justify that kind of thing. And you would say, and see, God did create. It just took a long time for him to do it. 6 literal days isn't the way it works. And then when God came down to Adam and Eve, maybe there were some anthropoids, but they're not really human. And then the next question, which I don't think he's really considered, is, well, how come we have Neanderthal DNA in us? And Denisovan and Homo erectus, as I understand now, too. And so that raises a huge question there. How do you tell that story? And I think that one of the things that Grudem is sensitive to, maybe not sensitive enough to, but at least sensitive to, is how do you tell the story of salvation if you're going to go absolute theistic evolution, creation or intelligent design unfriendly theistic evolution? How are you going to get a story of salvation? And his answer is, you have to really butcher it badly. It's not a round peg in a square hole. You have to basically make sawdust of the peg in order to get it into the hole. Comment there and then next.
Just a quick comment. You raised a good point about how do you fit Neanderthal DNA and all of that evidence into the human lineage. I want to protect Grudem's reputation. All the ideas I've seen in the book Theistic Evolution and the chapter that we've looked at, all those ideas were set in concrete basically in his Systematic Theology, which is dated 1994, long before they even knew about fossil DNA. So he doesn't even attempt to touch that issue.
Yeah, and that's fair, because, and in fact, it would be fair if he published this in 2006 or even 2014, because the fact of the matter is that even then, if you're not a specialist in the area, you may not be aware that there's a problem with what you do with the DNA that's and by the way, it's only 4%. Somehow we're 99% chimp, but we're only 4% Neanderthal. You figure that one out. Go ahead, and then...
Well, I guess it's obvious by my responses over a number of discussions that these kinds of things are quite interesting, can be fascinating. We can all walk out of here treating this as an academic discussion. For 50 years, I lived in an environment I loved where we were dealing with dedicated Adventist young people who were very sophisticated in science. And to tie a young creation to either, let's say, to tie it in a way it can't be separated and preserved to either old Earth or young Earth or anything in between is beyond destructive to some.
Are you talking about young life or old life?
No, I meant to say young life.
Okay.
What did I say?
Just making sure. You said old Earth and a young Earth, and that can be
I'm sorry.
interpreted in a couple of different ways.
In other words, what is crucial is to find support for and faith in young life. You step away from that, as I've seen with a number of young people who were unwilling to stick with young life. It was typically in correlation with a lot of other aspects of their Christianity, which is definitely not what we wanted to promote. So I would, having been at Andrews University for a very long time, I'm extremely familiar with the arguments that go around old Earth, young Earth. And help me, what name am I looking for from this? Yeah.
Old Earth Wetlands.
No. The Old Testament scholar who's so well known.
Well, there's several. Dick Davidson.
Yeah.
You may have referred to Hazel at one point.
Yes. The Hazel era was very, very difficult for many of us. I could give you chapter and verse, but it'd be better not to. But Dick Davidson and his students and a couple of colleagues have brought I think, a very respectable theology to old Earth, young life, without trying to argue that's the only interpretation. He made it work, and it worked for our students, for most of them. And to me, that is crucially important, to remember what is really central to this discussion, and that's God's creatorship. And that being relatively recent. So I think it would be fascinating at this point, if it were possible, to bring in the many years of scholarship by Dick Davidson and his crew to shed light on this. Not that it's crucial for me. I'm still in a position where I can go with it either way as long as I have young life and God's miraculous creatorship. And I think that's crucial, which is a bit we're all going to walk out of here believing what we believed when we walked in. And that's fine for us.
Well, we hope that at least some of us have seen a broader view, too.
Well,
and I'm not just talking about the people who disagree with me.
I should soften my statement.
Yeah.
We will all walk out of her thinking where we were is more logical than where we weren't.
Yes.
But we may change slowly.
Mm-hmm.
Some call it revolutionary.
So does the old Earth theory kind of give birth to infinitesimal point?
I'm sorry, the older
infinitesimal point where the whole universe came to life.
Well, but see, if you have the power of God, God can do that. So that's not...
Well, then life is possible within certain range of temperature variance.
Mm-hmm.
Testicles are 3.5 Fahrenheit cooler than the body. So the moon is moving away about 3.78 centimeters per year from the Earth.
Mm-hmm.
So if you put the moon back about half the way, you increase the gravity by 4 times. So the life would not be possible at that point because of the Earth would be covered with water twice a day. Same way the Earth is moving away from the sun 15 centimeters per year. So there has to be a point where life is possible. And should the time last, how long, life is not going to be possible because of loss of temperature in this Earth.
Yeah. Good point. No, actually, you raised some interesting points, and maybe we should pursue those another time. Because interestingly, when the moon is half the distance, it has 4 times the tides, and the accelerating effect of the Earth on the moon's orbit turns out to be significantly higher. I've seen some people who claim, and I haven't followed their mathematics yet, so I don't know how reliable it is, but the claim is made that actually the driving force to send the moon out is proportional to the 7th power of the distance. In which case, the moon actually, if you go backwards, spirals into the Earth at about 1.7 billion years, which of course is not going to be a reasonable figure in terms of standard cosmology. It will be interesting to see exactly how what the derivation of that is. Obviously, the fourth power is already a pretty impressive the tides being bigger. You'd expect it to be higher than the fourth power because of the closeness of the distance that the tides are starting to push. But that's a discussion that we probably should save for another time. Exactly how fast is the moon being pushed out, and how fast would it be? And is 4 billion years really a reasonable answer? And I don't know that we have that answer yet. But it's there's a whole bunch of things that are going on the solar system. How old can rings around Saturn, and now we discover around Jupiter and Neptune, and a little bit I think around Uranus as well. How stable are those ring systems? But those are interesting questions. If you have a God who creates the solar system, then they're not really a significant problem. But again, I don't think that those being there and having implications for the science don't necessarily have significant implications for theology. And I think that's the point we need to be careful about.
And also, the days are getting longer. So many years we have to add 1 second. You see,
right.
So when you consider this, the life being, for the life to exist on this earth, there has to be only a certain segment of time before and after.
Yeah.
It is not possible.
But I would be a little bit careful about those kinds of arguments, because let's say that the year was the same length, but there were 480 days in the year. It would mean that your day would be, about 18 hours long. I think life could adapt to that kind of thing. It's not really that bad. While we do have a fairly narrow range, it's not so narrow that 5 leap seconds are going to ruin us. Maybe even 5 leap minutes or leap days.
But the temperature is crucial.
The temperature is crucial, but there's
Absolutely.
a wide range of temperatures on the Earth that we can survive with. If you think about it, right now we survive with temperatures like what are outside today, and there are places where the temperature right now is below 0 degrees centigrade. If you're in Antarctica, granted, Antarctica doesn't have a lot of life in it. It has some, but probably more importantly, if the temperature goes down to minus 50 in Siberia, there are still trees living there. So the range at which life can exist is a little bit wider than what we sometimes think. In terms of a universal range, it's pretty narrow, because no life can really, certainly not multicellular life of the kind that we see, is going to live on either Jupiter or Saturn, or even one of its moons. They're just too cold.
Or too hot. Life is not possible in fire.
Right. There's no life on Mercury either. Again, you could have possibly, microscopic life that somehow is surviving deep within the planet or something, but certainly not the kind of life that we have with humans and dogs and cats and pine trees and that kind of stuff is just not going to take. It's not going to take on Mars. The atmosphere is too thin. So there's a lot of things that have to happen for life on Earth. It's better to say that God planned it that way, I think. Yes.
Just wanted to mention, I tend to lean towards an old Earth, young life model, as you well know. To me, one of the things that makes me lean towards that is hundreds of thousands of radiometric dates out there that you have to explain away. Without that you might explain at least from an inherited date pattern into sedimentary structures and so on during the flood type of thing. I find that our inadequacy there to be less than the inadequacy of trying to explain, say, for instance, changes in the basic forces of physics. This is going to upset everything in terms of changing rates of radiometric dating. It's true there are some slight changes that we note, but you don't have to change the basic forces of physics to do that. So I just thought I'd mention that aspect. Plus a number of verses in the Bible that lean towards that direction, but there I see, a more plausible solution than others.
Yeah. Well, frankly, I have a great deal of respect for that theory. I don't think that it's unquestionably wrong. We may find out that it is, in fact, the correct theory. And what that means is, among other things, as long as it is not directly contradictory to a fundamental theological doctrine, I don't have a major problem with accepting it as a reasonable possibility. I think that it's getting more difficult to figure out where you put Adam if you leave everything else alone. If you assume that we've got the dates all right, and then you put, does Adam and Eve predate, as I've said before, mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam? It seems instinctively those should coincide, or if anything, be lower, because what you really have for for Y chromosome Adam would be Y chromosome Noah, unless maybe there's more than one flood story, and maybe the flood story we have covers the Middle East, but there were refugia in, let's say, Australia, that somehow managed to survive on floating mats until the flood pretty much went down, and then kangaroos populated that area. I'm raising some interesting questions. It would still fit with the story that Noah's sons and Noah himself recorded what they saw. Everything was flooded, but they just didn't see the entire picture. What does that do to theology? If we're not all descended from Adam, there might be a problem. If we are not all descended from Noah, I'm not sure that there's that much of a problem. It's a different kind of scenario. I'm not saying that that's my favorite theory, but I'm saying that if somebody were to hold a theory like that, I don't think that we should reject that person out of hand. Well, for one thing, I think that one of the things that we need to be doing is making our theories fit the best evidence we have. And that includes our theological theories. But the best evidence that one person has may not necessarily be the same evidence that somebody else has because of the way they're brought up. And I think I'm a little bit cautious even about saying, well, you'll notice that Wayne Grudem even said explicitly, we're not saying that these people are not saved or that kind of thing. What we're saying is that at least from our point of view, they look like they're factually incorrect. And, you know, if everybody who had wrong ideas got killed for it, schools would not exist. Right? The whole point of having a school is to help people to understand stuff that they didn't understand before, and that in some cases they understood wrongly before.
Oh, does this kangaroo being able to be spared during the flood? I mean, you're just suggesting maybe it could be a possibility. Is that necessary, though? I mean, was the whole thing of I'm going to destroy this earth with flood, with the exception of Australia? I mean, that's not what I'm saying, but you know, is that so? Yeah. In the fire,
no, it's a reasonable objection to that kind of view.
Yeah, but I mean, did the Great Flood give birth to Australia, for example? And are these even moving away a little bit every year? An island is moving away from the mainland. The answer is yes. I mean, there's evidence that all of this, the land was together before the flood, perhaps.
Yes.
Okay. So
there are people who say that during the flood the land moved, and it moved in a fairly rapid rate, like in terms of 10 miles an hour, 20 miles an hour, that kind of movement, which is pretty decent movement for a whole continent.
Right. Well, the heritage singers used to sing a song, God said it, I believe it. Well, yes, but we also like evidence. And I think the Bible, even scientifically, gives enough for us to believe that we have been created at a specific time. If in the beginning God created the heaven and earth, well, if that in the beginning was how many million years ago, we have no problems with that. I don't. But, then he gives the Sabbath and all. That's fine. But you see, and what has been presented in the Bible, is that enough for my salvation? My answer is yes. I have nowhere else to go. Well, to me, Adventism stands or falls, for me, my own Adventism stands and falls on sanctuary doctrine. When we destroy that, or we poo-poo that, or we put it in the side, then everything crumbles. That was my problem with the Sabbath service. I'm a pastor's son. I do not like to criticize pastors. But you see, there are certain things that we cannot and should not. Now, is there anything problems with the message? The answer is no. Method, big time. Okay, so perhaps that's the way we should look at things. I cannot question the message and still stay within Adventism. I don't like long time ago. Thank you.
Well, we will delve further into the Old Testament next week. I don't know if we'll finish the entire chapter. That depends on how well I can compress it. And one of the things I'm hoping to do is not to be giving his entire view and then finish in 1 hour, and then that way, all the discussion has to be beyond that. I'd like to leave some time to discuss. So we will see how well it can be compressed, and you'll get to see the Old Testament evidence, which I think is it's fascinating, and it may be worth 2 Sabbaths, but we'll see as I get further along. I'll be sending an email, and you'll get to know how far I've gotten.